Good morning, Encounter Church. It is a beautiful Sunday morning out there. We want you to come in and we want you to start your week worshiping with us. Please stand. Who breaks the power of sin and darkness? Who love is mighty and so much stronger?
Breathe Good morning. Welcome to Encounter Church. My name is Chris Causey. I'm lead pastor here, and I'm so glad that you are here for our kickoff of our brand new series called The Gift, which is there. It's kind of crazy. It's December, right? Like that. Is anybody else caught off by the fact that it's December? Because that kind of got me out of nowhere. I looked down and I was like, how in the world has this happened that we've made it through 2022 almost? So today we kind of want to kick off a series to hopefully as you go into the Christmas season, that this would be a season that's a gift to you. It's meant to be a gift to you. That we don't just give gifts, that we give gifts in response to the greatest gift that we've ever gotten. And in some ways, I want to walk with you this morning and hopefully in the process give you a gift. Not like Oprah style where it's like you get a car and you get a car and you get a car, but a gift that I think is actually even more significant than a car, because a car will eventually break down. I mean, my car is almost 20 years old, and at this point, it's a point of pride for me to see, like, can I make it legal? Can it get to 21 and stand on its own 2 feet? Like, I mean, there's a certainty that I want to help guide you towards this morning. And to get there, I want to take you to a cathedral in Germany in the 1930s. A little bit of backdrop that you should know about Germany in the 1930s is at this point, the Nazi Party has become kind of the ruling party in Germany. Hitler and his obsessions are now starting to become policy. And at this point, the world's not really awoken to who he is and what his party is about, but he's already starting to rewrite Germany and Germany's history. And part of it actually happens in this cathedral. This cathedral was built in the 1300s. So like a lot of things in Europe that you will find is there's some really, really old churches. This dates back to the medieval times. And part of the medieval cathedral kind of MO was you would have murals and artworks that decorate the walls. And so this particular cathedral had gone through a renovation in the 1800s, and when the Nazi Germany party came in to power, they had an obsession, certain high-level leaders in the Nazi party had an obsession with art. And the philosophy of the art around that time period for them was that everything should be taken back to its original. That was kind of at the heart of Hitler's distortion, was that we should return to the original, to the pure, to the core. And so this wasn't just around people, this was in the art too. So they commissioned a father and a son and an additional worker to go into the cathedral and fix the murals that had been what they had saw modified and improved upon in the 1800s. So the team goes in and they begin to try to strip away some of the paint that had come through the renovation. And in the process, they did a really good job of stripping away the paint and took it down to zero. So now they're staring at walls that the Nazi leadership expects are going to be restored, pure medieval art from the 1400s. And they have blank walls. So they begin to utilize the third party of this little trio. Never was a famous artist, but he had a unique gift. He was essentially the equivalent of someone who really did good voice impersonations. You notice people who, like, they can hear a voice. I mean, you can pretty much build an SNL career, Saturday Night Live career out of it if you're really good at it. Like, this guy was the equivalent of that for art. He could mimic almost any style that was placed in front of him. And so that's exactly what he did. He mimicked medieval cartoonish type drawings. And one of the things that he drew was this. Now, they opened it up to great fanfare. The Nazi leadership comes in. They're admiring all of the restored, pure art. And as more and more people passed through the cathedral, some people started to notice that there were 8 of these. Now, I doubt any of us are ornithologists in this room, and so none of you are screaming foul. And but some did. They walked through, and they noticed that these were wild turkeys. Now, the problem with wild turkeys is what you and I already intuitively know, because they cross the street in front of you. They come through your backyards, right? We have a lot of wild turkeys here because they're native to North America. They're native to this side of the world. Any turkey in any other part of the world prior to the 1300s did not exist. They weren't real. In fact, turkeys didn't show up in Europe until 1600s. So the fact that a medieval mural in Germany with wild turkeys upon it should have been a sign to anyone that this mural is not pure, it's not right, it's not true, it's clearly been modified. So what does the Nazi leadership do with the 8 wild turkeys at the bottom? They come in and they have a revelation. This painting proves what they long suspected, that long before the British or the Spanish or the Portuguese ever set foot in North America, the purebred Germans had already been there. And as evidence of that, we must have brought back turkeys to Germany for the medieval artists to have seen and to have painted. So one of the chief propagandists for the Nazi artists literally incorporates his storyline into the textbooks that are being taught to German kids. Photos of this entire cathedral are circulated around Germany, and this becomes the history that the Vikings, a very distinct strain of the Vikings, who are the German purebred, like bloods that are like, I did it again, like their people discovered it and brought back, and this is proof of it. You see, fake news is not an us thing today. Fake news is a human thing. The tendency to collectively to buy into lies and to kind of live out those lies and ignore the truth is something that we do as humans really, really well. And we've done it since the very first moment in the garden when we chose that path. This is a broken tendency we all have. And the reason I think this is an important kind of story Tim Hartford kind of clued me in on, because I'd never heard of this story, and then I read and started studying. It's like, this is ridiculous. This was seen as factual evidence. This was the story that was told. And I think if we're not careful, that the Christmas story can kind of fall into that too. That we as a culture can kind of just collect stories, put them up on the shelf, and really not even think about it. That what was true of the Germans in the 1930s around this notion of wild turkeys can happen in our lives. We have stories that have been told that we've never questioned. In fact, we have stories that have been told that we allow to tell us what to do. And I think it's worth taking a step back and saying, hey, what about Christmas? Let's not be these people, right? Who, it says at the bottom, turkey legs, the ultimate medieval treat. I think there's an element that people look at Christians and they see this. They're like, oh, these people have bought into this notion. They believe this stuff hook, line, and sinker, and it's not even true. And we live in a culture that doesn't even push too hard, because why? Sincerity is the ultimate. It doesn't matter if what you believe is true. It just matters how much you believe it. Sincerity, authenticity. That's, you got your truth, I got my truth. And fortunately for us, Christianity doesn't land there. That your faith isn't just something that's sincere that you hold. Your faith is something that's big enough to hold you. But in order to do that, it needs to be true, not just sincere. And my hope is that Christmas takes on a little bit more power for us this morning and a little bit more certainty for us this morning, and that we don't just put it up on the shelf in the same way that maybe the Super Mario Advent calendar gets put up on your shelf too as you open each day. Because we have a good way of just kind of collecting stories and putting them up on the shelf, and that Christmas, All the different stories, right? Think about the different stories that are wrapped in Christmas. We've got the really large guy who's a criminal mastermind who breaks into homes every year on the same day, and yet we've not been able to catch him. He's been doing this for a really long time. And the only reason he's getting away with it is he's reverse thieving. He's breaking in to leave stuff, right? Then we got this like snowman who wakes up in the middle of the night, who's got friends, who's running around playing with children, for crying out loud, unsupervised, singing songs and taking them on like transcontinental railroad trips. Like, hello? Like a predatorial snowman. We've got some demon elf who sits on a shelf, who the next morning when you wake up has done something mischievous and is in a different part of your house. I'm just being real, people. If I had a doll moving around my house while I was sleeping that night, I'd have a different house. But we just have all these stories. And one of the popular kind of movements right now in our culture is the Advent calendar, right? From Legos to Star Wars to Harry Potter to chocolate. Not knocking any of them. But the word Advent literally comes from the root for Latin, for arrival. Advent was about the arrival of someone, the anticipation of that. And so my hope is in some ways not to take all those other stories away from you, but to give you the confidence and the certainty of the story. In fact, to even go beyond that, to even boldly say that there is not a Christmas story to be told. There was a moment in history that was meant to be responded to. That when we hear the word Christmas, that we stop thinking it's a story that's meant to be told. But that it was a historical event that was so significant, it demands a response. And to do that, to receive that gift, I want to take you to Luke. Luke is found in the kind of the opening pages of the New Testament. It's one of the 4 biographical accounts of the life of Jesus. And I just want to read Luke's opening statement and walk you through it. Nothing magical about it, just kind of help you understand who Luke was and what Luke was trying to do, and then kind of grab hold of a little bit of a grander perspective. The thing to know about Luke is that we know Luke was a medical doctor. Historical documents kind of cross-referencing lets us know that he was a well-educated, really gifted writer. I mean, Luke was a man who grew up in probably the area close to where Paul grew up. There was a famous medical school in the ancient world in Tarsus, which is where Paul had kind of grown up and was educated. So it's possible Paul, who's one of the, kind of the most prolific writers in the New Testament, one of the most prolific kind of like spreaders of Christianity, literally meets Luke at some point growing up, or meets him in some of the avenues. Paul was considered, even by non-Christian sources, to be one of the smartest men alive at that time frame. Luke was kind of equally brilliant. And the reason we know that is if you spend time studying what Luke writes his letters in, which is this kind of version of Greek that was popular in the day, it's really obvious in the language. It's like the difference between Tomater from the Cars and like hearing the Queen give a speech, right? You know there's a gap, okay? It's like they're speaking the same language, but there's a little bit of some distance in the words that they choose. And this is kind of Luke. It's obvious when he opens his mouth, he's not Tomater. His word selection, his vocabulary, the ways that he's able to paint pictures and add details makes it clear he's in the medical profession and he's brilliant. And so Luke writes what becomes a 2-volume set of the book of Luke and the book of Acts. And he opens up his letter with this statement here. You know, I don't want you to read it. I just want to read it out loud to you at first, because I think it's important to understand why he writes this. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the first who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught." Okay, this really long sentence that looks like two sentences here, is the very opening to what we call the book of Luke. So the Romans word for the word book was actually the word roll. And the reason why is because up until this point in history, there's about to be a revolution. Up until this point in human history, what we call books were just scrolls. They were wrapped up, they were rolled up. It was a very efficient way of keeping content. So there was naturally an issue, right? If you wanted to know what was in a book, it was really hard to just go, right? And like in doing that, you could damage it. It was really expensive. Like the artistry and the craftsmanship to even make a scroll meant that it was so expensive you just didn't come in and like launch the thing like it was some rug unfurling in your house. So the ancients came up with this quite brilliant way of dealing with this. If you've got a library filled with scrolls, they all look the same. How do you know which scroll is the scroll you need? So what they did was they invented this idea of the opening passage. You would walk up to the scroll, you could flip open the flap, just pull it back, and the opening flap would have a sentence. And that sentence was essentially the equivalent of the back of a book like we have today. So if you're browsing in a bookstore like some human beings still do, or in a library like I've been told still humans do, right? You don't read the entire book, you walk up, you look at the back of it, or you look at what Amazon says about it in the digital description, and you're like, oh, that's a book I want to read. Or that's a book I don't want to read. And this is what Luke does. Luke writes in the opening of a scroll, hey, here's what this scroll is about. Here's what this scroll's purpose is. Here's why I wrote this. And this is important because this lays out from the very get-go what Luke is trying to do. In fact, Luke says at the very beginning that many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. I think it's helpful to know we live in a world of words. I mean, when's the last time you met someone who could not read that was beyond the age of 6? Think about it. I remember vividly as a young boy discovering the secret that my next door neighbor, I remember noticing one day he signed his signature and it was just an X. And because I was young and stupid, I asked his wife, why did he write the letter X? And she kind of whispered to me, he doesn't really know how to read or write. And I was like, oh my goodness. I'd never met a human being that couldn't read or write. It was so out there for me. And most of us have never met someone in our world who can. But in this world, that was the norm. Reading and writing were not a common, accessible skill set. And so naturally, a lot of things didn't get written about because there were only a small group of people who could write. Writing was incredibly expensive. The tools to write with, not just the training of writing, was incredibly inaccessible. So that the fact that Luke opens his statement with many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us is extraordinary. Because we live in a day and an age where everybody will write a biography. Everybody is self-publishing in some form, whether it's on social media, some vlog, Instagram. Right? We all naturally self-publish in different ways, but even you and I know, when you die, how many people are lining up to write a biography about you or me? Does anybody have any biographies lined up to be written about them? Like, no. So even in a culture that is obsessively self-publishing, it's still incredibly rare for the average person to have anything written about them. And yet, Luke leads out in a day and age where writing was so rare, the resources to write were so beyond what even the most educated people had access to. And he makes an opening statement that, hey, Jesus, a lot of people are trying to write about him. So many people are focused on trying to kind of draw up the account of the things that have happened. This sentence has so much weight because Luke is saying out of the gate, like, wow, this is what happened in Israel. Is so abnormal, so extraordinary that people are coming out of the woodworks. If you can write, you are writing about what happened. And then he says an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. He's making the statement very clear from the get-go. This is not turkey legs. This is an event. This is a thing that occurred. And not only is this a thing that occurred, this is a really extraordinarily good thing. Like, it's caught the attention of the entire empire. I mean, you and I could read the New York Times today. If you read the New York Times today, you would consume more news in that one sitting than anyone in this kind of, up and really, honestly, until 1700s, you would read more in that one sitting than someone living their entire life would get in news. Like, it just, and this was such great, big, crazy news that it spread throughout the entire Roman Empire. Even Caesar's household knew about this carpenter, turned rabbi, miracle worker, crucified, resurrected guy named Jesus. And not only is this writing, is this happening, Luke makes the statement to say, this happened among us. Hey, this isn't the guy walking into the medieval cathedral trying to guess what happened and what birds were there 200 or 300 years ago. No, Luke makes the bold statement that just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the very first were eyewitnesses. Luke's like, man, I sat down with these people. I traveled with these people. I heard stories with these people. I sat across from Mary hearing the story about the birth of Jesus and hearing about her cousin Elizabeth and John, their son. She's like, one of the things that's fascinating that we know historically is that Paul and Timothy, who are associated as like really good, Paul was like a mentor, Timothy was his mentee. Timothy was kind of faithful to Paul towards the end. But there was someone else, in fact, the only person who was with Paul through his final imprisonment that would ultimately end with him being beheaded, was Luke. We have one of Paul's writings about his final days, and he references that there's only one person who's still with me here. There's only one person because there was no social welfare system in prisons. So if you were in prison, the guards didn't give you food or water. You had to depend on the kindness of someone else. So Luke was the only person who was present with Paul in his final days. Luke was the one who was, with his money and his resources and his time, going out and getting food and water to keep Paul alive. And so, like, Luke writes in the book of Acts, there's periods of time where the word we comes into play because Luke travels with Paul. So Luke is saying to the person he's writing this letter to, like, man, I have done extensive investigation and detailed work. Like, this wasn't something that happened hundreds of years ago. This happened in our generation. It's like, imagine 50 years from now, 40 years from now, you tell the story about the pandemic. There was a pandemic in 1918. There's been a bunch of pandemics, but the 1918 is the one that this one would be compared to some. Like, 1918 was a story that you might have read if you read certain stories about pandemics. Like, you lived history through that. So when you talk about it, it's going to be a whole different perspective than what someone 100 years from now would read. And this is Luke's point. He's like, man, I sat with these people. Like, I was there with them. I was eyewitnesses to Paul's miracles, to the man who met Jesus, traveling with Mark, who writes the other biographical account of the life of Jesus, who writes the second of the four. Right? So Luke is trying to communicate this. And then he says, but with this in mind, there's so many people writing, there's so many people who are alive who've been around this, who've experienced the power of the miracles. He was like, so you know what I decided to do? I carefully investigated, like, everything from the beginning. Luke is, in this opening flap, trying to give you a picture of what this book is going to contain. He's like, he doesn't just investigate, he carefully investigates. He with particular focus and detail and diligence and discipline, he peers into everything. He's like, man, I left no stone unturned. And I went all the way back to the beginning to make sure I fully understood what this thing was. Right? In some ways, I think the equivalent of like Luke's mindset would be like the Spotlight team with the Boston Globe. Right? Like if you're a business or you're an individual who's doing some shady stuff, right? No offense to the Patch, but if the Patch reaches out to you and wants a comment, and the Patch is like the local news things that you can get, right? And they ask a question, you're probably not going to like, man, they're going to figure me out, right? Like the Patch is not leading the way in deep, exposing, investigative journalism. The great Patch is great if you want to know like about the, you know, the hay rile or like what vote happened in the town meeting. But like the Patch is not going to unlock the deep secrets that have been like completely covered up for decades. But this team, if they ever call you and you're a business who's doing some shady stuff, or you're an organization who's doing some, you might as well just start confessing to save yourself some time and embarrassment. Because they're gonna do it. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church, arguably one of the most powerful religious organizations on planet Earth, had orchestrated massive amounts of cover-up and used religion as a tool to keep the lock turned tight. Because religion is a powerful force. It can even be used dangerously, manipulatively, to control people. That's why people are like, oh, religion's bad. I'm like, no. People are bad. And people who are bad understand the power of religion. And so religion is one of the levers that you pull to control people. And the Roman Catholic structure of the day did that. And it was an unbreakable force. And yet this team breaks it all open. Not just here, cause cracks and fractures that are still rippling globally to this day. Because this is one of the best investigative journalistic teams on planet Earth. And when Luke says, I carefully investigated, this is what he's referring to. He's like, I left no stone unturned. I left no corner, no dark place, like no remote village untraveled. I looked at everything from the very beginning. And in doing so, I took all of that information and I put it together in an orderly, thoughtful way that you can grasp and understand what had happened. Luke makes this incredible assertion in the very opening sentence of this book, like you can trust what you read when you read what I've written. Because I put in the work, I put in the intellect, I put in the skill set. I did all of that. That's the gift I have for you in the side of this scroll. But if you're going to understand the book of Luke, there's one other thing that you need to know, and it's right after where I stopped. He says, most excellent Theophilus. So Luke writes all of this because of this man here. Theophilus, especially with the title most excellent, was clearly powerful and wealthy. And he pays Luke to investigate. I think Theophilus, from just the context of what we're going to see in the book of Luke, and then if you read the book of Acts, is that Theophilus is trying to figure out Christianity. He's been taught some things. And he's not a person who sits down to Google for 5 minutes and calls it research. He's going to actually put significant amount of resources and time to unleash this man, Luke, to go and find out what Christianity is really about. So all of the book of Luke was written for one man to read. It's like a presidential briefing about Christianity and about Jesus. And he does this with finally saying, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Theophilus had some doubts. Theophilus wasn't sure about Christianity. He'd been taught some things. But Theophilus understood that sincerity was not enough. Experience was not enough. He wanted to know the truth. He wanted to know, is this real? And it makes sense. Why? Because he's most excellent, Theophilus. He's a man with power and influence. He has prominence in the ancient world. And you know what you lost in the ancient world when you started following Jesus? Power, prosperity, and prominence. For the first 300 years of Christianity, it did not make you influential. It was not a lever of power. It was a reason you were oppressed or persecuted. It was a reason you did not get promoted in your job. It was a reason that you could not feed your family. Following Jesus was hard and costly. And so Theophilus needed to know, if I bet my life on this thing, is there a life to this thing? Is this thing true? And Luke delivers this report to him. Luke never, I don't think, ever had a box for 2,000 years ago for that his writings would still be read today. He was writing this account for Theophilus. He had presented this research for Theophilus. Not for you, not for me. Which is extraordinary. And it says something about this book. Luke just wanted to know, Theophilus, hey, if you're questioning following Jesus, you know what? It may be valid to question following Jesus because you know you may lose the most excellent title. It may be it may be valid if you're wrestling with this Christianity thing because of the way it's going to hit you financially, the way it's going to affect you vocationally, because of the way it's going to have ramifications on your family. Like Theophilus, all those things are valid concerns. But if you're questioning Christianity because you're not sure if Jesus was real and the things that he did was real, like you don't need to worry about that, Theophilus. Based on what I've done, there is no reason not to follow Jesus because of historicity. He's true. He's real. He's a person. Because Christianity, when it first started, was not built on these simple child songs that the Bible tells me so. It was built on a moment. It was built on a birth. A realization that God had stepped into earth. His name was Jesus. And that this carpenter turned rabbi, miracle worker, teacher, speaker, ultimately gets crucified as a Roman criminal, and then 3 days later comes out of the grave with one of the most easily disputable, like fake news stories ever. Because if someone claims to rise from the dead, you know what all you have to do to disprove that? Find the body. Like if you just show the corpse, it completely dispels the notion that they came back from the dead. And yet, this story starts to spread, and Luke comes back to the realization after spending time seeing the miracles, doing the research, to say, Theophilus, man, if you're concerned about truth, double down on Jesus because I'm certain it's true. Now, this was 2,000 years ago. How do we know we're not these people? Like, maybe you'll give me that there was a guy named Luke. There was a guy named Theophilus 2,000 years ago. But Theophilus and Luke's certainty, it's not the same thing as your certainty and my certainty. Like, we could still be these people, right? Who are walking around proudly displaying our medieval turkey leg. And the reason I think that you and I can be just as certain and confident as Theophilus was 2,000 years ago is because of a handful of different reasons, but this is one of them. So the original, this is Luke, by the way, not as easily read and as graphically displayed as what you just saw, but this is Luke nonetheless. So Christianity begins to spread. You have the writings of Christianity that are being circulated. Luke is one of them because what Luke produces for Theophilus is so compelling and so helpful that Christians start to copy it and spread it amongst. You have letters being written by Paul, Peter, James, right? These variety of leaders that they all understood had been with Jesus, had significant insight to who Jesus was. They're circulating. And for 300 years, they circulate in secrecy. Because if you're caught holding it, it was criminal. If you're caught spreading it, it's criminal. Christianity broke one of the only religious laws in the Roman Empire, which was to ascribe divinity to someone higher than Caesar. That was like the one unpardonable religious law. If you wanted to worship Jupiter, if you wanted to believe Jupiter married his sister, and you wanted to kind of believe all of that stuff, you wanted to have dozens and dozens of gods that you sacrifice to, that's great. As long as you didn't put anyone above Caesar, you were okay. And then Christianity comes along, and they in fact, the Roman Empire, one of the phrases was Caesar is Lord. And then Christianity comes along, and they're like, no, Jesus is Lord. And it's a direct conflict. So these writings circulate for hundreds of years. After Christianity, after Constantine becomes emperor, and one of his first things, probably to kind of aggregate power, quite honestly, if I'm being cynical, because at that point, a lot of the Roman Empire, over 10% of the Roman Empire at that point was Christians. So he does it to consolidate power, and he makes Christianity the state religion. And for the first time in hundreds of years, these secret writings could come out. And there's an argument sometime, well, the Bible didn't even come into existence until 300 AD plus. And it's like, no, 300 AD plus was when canonization occurred, when it was the first time Christian texts were able to come out in public for the first time. But the recognition of what was the Bible, of what was sacred, had been around for hundreds of years. Right? One of my mentors says, you know what? You don't put something in a hotel safe to make it valuable, right? You put it in the safe because it is valuable. Putting something in a safe that's not valuable does not make it more valuable. And what had been known, validated, and valued for hundreds of years were these kind of texts. And so the first day the hotel safe was finally able to be opened, they all get brought out. And we have thousands of these things. Thousands of them. If you've ever read any ancient literature, so there's 25,000 manuscripts, copies, pieces, across different languages of the New Testament. The second most copied book in antiquity was the Iliad. Now, I doubt any of you are going to be on Twitter tonight railing against Homer and the Odyssey and calling it fake news, right? Pliny the Elder, the Peloponnesian Wars, all these great ancient writings, there are just a dozen of manuscripts. We have over 5,000 just from the first few, up until the 12th century in Greek. This was not, what I read today wasn't just something that's recently evolved because some guy named King James decided to create it. This was the words we read with confidence are the words that were written. And I think the reason that I wanted to give you this kind of heady idea at the very beginning of this series is because Christmas as an event is a gift. It's an event to be responded to. And like Theophilus, it can be one we have with certainty, confidence. Like, look, if Christmas is real, if God really did step into humanity, it changes everything. It changes how you live your life. It changes how you walk out. It changes how you do your taxes. Changes how you treat people who disagree with you. It changes how you see hopelessness and despair. Like, look, if Christianity is real, then death is not your future. Life is. If Christianity is real, guilt is not your freedom, is not your future. Grace is. If Christianity is real, shame is not your future. Freedom is. Chaos is not your future. Peace is. Despair is not your future. Hope is. Like, if Christianity is real, it changes everything. We are not people who walk around the medieval fair gnawing on our turkey legs, thinking we're experiencing history. We are people who have thoughtfully, historically, we're a part of a movement that was birthed out of God's pursuit of love of you and me. And in the course of that pursuit of Him for 30 years walking among us and then stepping out and demonstrating His message with miracles and people educated, thoughtful, intellectually, like honest people looked into Him and responded to Him. And for 300 years, Luke's writing should have never made it as far as it did. But the reason it did is because there were people like you who followed Jesus, who believed sincerely that what we have is real, but understood that sincerity is not enough by itself, that it had to be anchored in something more than that. It had to be anchored in something more than my experience. It had to be anchored in something more than my circumstances or what my mama or my daddy taught me. It had to be anchored in an event, in history. And that's why you and I can be confident. That's why you and I can be certain. Not just about Christmas, but all the things that will flow out of the reality of what Christmas is actually about. And that's why when we say Merry Christmas, we're actually declaring that there is a gift that changes how we see everything. And that gift is Jesus. Let's pray. Father, thank you for Luke. Thank you for who he is and what he does and what he says, and for the picture of truth that he pursued. Thank you that we're not people who have faith in faith. That for those who follow Jesus, that our faith is actually anchored in someone. And that someone is not religious leaders, it's not our grandparents, it's not our parents, it's you, Jesus. That what you did, what you said, what you taught, your crucifixion and your resurrection, God, that they paved a way for us to be restored. They paved a way for us to experience hope and joy and peace. They paved a way for us to give forgiveness to people who've wronged us. They paved the way for us to love in the midst of a world that so often is defined by messages of hate. And thank you for the gift of Christmas and the gift of you. And all that flows out of you, Jesus. And it's in your name that I pray. Amen. I want to thank you for allowing me to kind of set the tone, a little bit of a different Christmas message than probably what you think when you think about Christmas series and church and Advent. But I think it's important to know that, like, we have an anchor, that we have a certainty, we have a confidence, that you didn't have to check your brain to watch this live stream. You didn't have to check your brain to walk into this room and be like, maybe this is true. That what we have is strong. It's a foundation. It's an anchor for a storm. It's a declaration that you're loved. God's love is passionate. That it's bigger than our screw-ups and our mess-ups. Like, that's the good news, is that he came for you and for me, and that no matter who you are, no matter what you've done, no matter how unsure, uncertain, no matter, like, whatever. The fact that God intentionally uses Luke to answer the doubts and the questions of Theophilus. He's still in the business of doing it today. There's some of you who are probably Theophilus in that room, in this room. They're just unsure and uncertain. As a church, you can tell, obviously, I have a passion. Like, I want to facilitate conversation where you don't check your brain, where you can be sure and certain that what we believe is a historical event, not turkey legs at a medieval fair. And that maybe for some of you, like Theophilus, you're kind of leaving this time and you're like, man, I'm more certain. Right? That just to say, maybe today's the day that you step into this thing. You realize, hey, there's no valid reason for me not to follow Jesus, outside of maybe a personal reason of just not wanting to do it. But if my hang up has been around history and truth, today that's out the door. And if that's the case, we would love to engage with you in our app. We have a section called Faith that you can click on. There, you've got more questions. We'd love to send you a book. I'd love to have coffee with you. For some of you, like even this morning, I got an email from somebody who's going to be baptized on the 18th. And I love that. We were kind of talking. He was like, man, can I bring 8 to 10 people? Because I want people to know this Jesus thing in my life. And I was like, yeah, you invite, like, man, if you want to invite 80 people, I'm okay with that. Because he's certain. He's sure of what he's found. And maybe for some of you, that's your next step. Is like coming public with this personal realization of like, no, Jesus is who he says he is. And if that's the case, we'd love to have you be a part of that baptism service on the 18th. But for all of us today, as we kind of close out our service and wrap up, we want to finish with this song and this declaration about his love. Because Merry Christmas is a statement of love. It's a statement of grace and pursuit. So I want to invite you to stand as our team leads us in closing out today with this declaration of Merry Christmas.
I love that song, God's love is reckless. Like Jesus talks about how if I had 100 sheep and they're all good and everybody's together, I have them all together, but if one wanders off, I'm going to leave the 99 and go chase the one. He's saying that's what I do. I will chase you and I will come after you and I will keep chasing you over and over again, no matter how far you run, no matter what you've done, no matter how you live your life. He will keep coming after you and chasing you because he loves us that much. And that's what Christmas is about, that we know that Jesus came to make a way for us to go back to God, and he will never stop chasing after you. We hope you found today's message helpful. A couple things going on. Students, grades 6 through 12, we do meet tonight here at the church, 6 to 7:30. Men, we have a men's group that meets every other Monday night. That is tomorrow night at 7 o'clock here at the church. It's awesome. Lots of men come. So if you're looking for a place to connect, we'd love to have you. We look forward to seeing you back next week. We hope you have an awesome week as we next week will continue our series, The Gift. God bless. Take care, and we'll see you next week.